questions and passages on the Advanced Placement in Literature and Composition exam. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about each section and then give you some stems that I've seen in previous AP exams. So the first type of stem is, or type of question is going to focus on the dramatic situation of a poem. Another way to look at this is the plot of the poem. So is there a speaker? Is the speaker situated somewhere? Is there a physical location? Or is this just kind of like a philosophical rant? Is there any kind of setting to like a time and place to the poem that you might want to consider? Some of these stems look like this. Based on lines 5 through 8, the speaker is most likely, or it'll talk about the poem being primarily addressed to that audience, a specific audience. The next type of question is going to focus on the structure of the poem, how it's organized. Is it organized into stanzas? Do the stanzas correlate with each other, or are they meant to be very, very different? Does one stanza correlate with something that's not necessarily right next to it? So it's going to be asking you about how things are put together. And then this might be thematically, it might be through the prosody of the poem, it might also be through an extended metaphor, or they might actually ask you if you were to put in a split or a new stanza where you would do it. Next is theme. They're going to be questioning you about what the author's observing about the human condition. With poetry, it's a little bit easier to pull those out because the word choice is so much more concise and it's so much more figurative that it's easier to kind of let your mind wander to relate it to the entire human condition. So the meaning of a stanza, they might ask you to break it down stanza by stanza, or might tell you what the poet is rejecting instead of celebrating. So that's kind of the opposite of what they're creating in their poem. Grammar and meaning, this is specifically in the context. So they'll be asking you to sometimes give a definition or a synonym and rephrase things. So, and you'll look at that first example that I pulled up there, like, that doesn't even make sense. Like, why, if I'm not looking at the poem, obviously, a glass is a glass is a glass. That doesn't even make sense unless if the author is using it symbolically, then that's going to change the connotation of it. So they might give you a choice that looks on, like some sort of clear obstacle that one can see through instead of something that is formed from molten sand. Images and figurative language. A lot of times poets use one dominant image to kind of correlate and weave throughout their entire poem. So they'll probably ask you specifically about those more extended ones. Now, I know a lot of us like to throw around the word diction because, diction is word choice and everybody uses words. But the true, when we're really analyzing a poet or an author's diction, we're talking about, is there a specific kind of diction? Are they using negative or pejorative? Or are they using words that sound a specific way? Are we talking about a connotation of a word because of its sound? So we're not just looking at the words. I mean, that's what we start with, but you're naming what kind of diction that the author or poet is using. So when they use a verb like suggest, to suggest, that's when we talk about connotation. And then this last is tone and prosody. We've talked about prosody throughout the course of the year, meaning the rhyme scheme and the meter or the beats per line, whether or not that's a regular repeated structure or if it's free verse and there's not really any kind of regularity to it. And the tone is the author's attitude. So these questions might ask you to focus on a specific stanza or an entire poem. When we look at sonnets, remember that there is a tone shift about halfway through those, a little bit over halfway through. And then it might ask you to name a specific type of prosody. Now, iambic pentameter is the most well-known, and that's what Shakespeare wrote in. The others, we haven't talked a lot about them because, frankly, you might get 1 or 2 questions on this the whole AP test, and I really don't see this as being a big issue when you're going to college and having to know all of the different types of prosody that are out there. Okay. And next we're going to talk about prose, the types of questions and the stems that you'll get with prose. So just a reminder that prose is regular written language that's written in paragraph form and tells a story. First, very similar to the dramatic situation, this is going to be the situation and the content. They're going to be asking to identify like where this is taking place, how you know, is a time period, is there a context to it that's important to understand, identifying the main subject. Even though it's fiction, it might be talking about one motif that we've talked about, and they want you to identify that. And again, identifying main ideas of individual paragraphs. Meaning of words and phrases, very similar to poetry. This is going to be questions that ask you to break down how words can be used in multiple different ways. In the example that I put up here, you can see that there are multiple meanings, and they're asking you to pull the one meaning that is not being employed. So that's one of those distractors that we talked about in the earlier video, because it says except. But it's important to note that lots of words have multiple meanings, and sometimes the author means to use all of those meanings. I don't know if you guys ever had to diagram sentences, but it really helped. It was very helpful for me, and I remember learning how to do that when I was young. And actually, I never had to worry about it again until I became an English teacher, and I had to do it myself with my students. But it's interesting how much I have learned to break down sentences to get to the truly important parts of it because of that skill. So in prose, they're going to be asking you about some grammar things like the antecedent of it, because it's important if you note what pronoun is replacing what noun. Because sometimes when authors get kind of rambling, they deliberately try to make it ambiguous. So you don't know what the antecedent is, and you have to keep that in mind because it impacts the theme. We've actually done this once with something we've read in class with the subject of the verb. You'll see that it says on line 13, and the reason why they're giving you the line is because you need to go back in. You and I both know that authors like to write very long sentences sometimes. So don't just look on line 13. On those kind of questions, you're going to have to look in the lines leading up to and the lines following to make sure that you get the whole context. We just talked about diction with the poetry, and now we'll talk about it with prose. It's very similar. Why does the author use specific verbs? We talked about this with Hamlet, the fact that he chose to use the verbs in the to be or not to be soliloquy to use the infinitives because that kind of demonstrated Hamlet's inability to act because he couldn't even conjugate a verb. So believe it or not, authors are that deliberate in their choice of verbs. Figurative language. You've been talking about figurative language for a long time. We've all talked about how that can't literally happen, which is the definition of figurative, is something that's not literally happening. So in this, you're going to be looking to break down metaphors and similes and personification and imagery and all of those things. Structure. Believe it or not, the structure of a prose piece is just as important as poetry. Some of the authors that we've read, including Hemingway, who writes in a lot of dialogue, so there's not a lot of lengthy paragraphs with imagery versus people who go on and on, like Mary Shelley, who is so poetic in the way she structures her paragraphs and her sentences. So it's something to pay attention to, and usually authors try to relate their structure to some greater meaning. So these questions are going to ask you to kind of analyze that and figure out why those happen the way they do. And that's one of my funny little literary elements there. So if you look down in the corner, we have life is decidedly not good for the person who owns that car. So literary techniques like irony, if that's not a good example, I don't know what is, where they're asking you to break down which ones, sometimes just straight up identify which are examples of irony or paradox or oxymoron, as silent scream is, as well as alliteration. So straight up identification. In the first video, I gave you a whole bunch of different literary terms, so you could feel free to make sure you're well versed in those for these kinds of questions where they're asking you to identify. And when we talk about rhetoric, we're talking about just the manipulation of language in general. And this is going to be asking you to focus on the functions and what effect certain things have. So these are some stems that I've pulled from earlier AP exams. The last sentence of a paragraph, sometimes, like if we look at the function of the last sentence of every, except for one, every chapter in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, it was to foreshadow. So that was more of a rhetorical style that these kinds of questions would focus on. And then we're talking about tone. We've been talking about tone a whole bunch this year as far as the author's attitude. And the easiest way for you to break that down is to identify, one, if it's positive or negative. Because when you look at the choices that the multiple choice questions give you, they'll probably have some that are positive and negative, and you'll need to kind of delineate which ones you can eliminate right off the bat because it doesn't even fall on one side of the chart, so to speak.